Hi there. Welcome to another great session on day 2 of WordCamp Santa Clarita 2021. Right now, you are tuned into the 2 p.m. talk with Christina Workman in the accessibility-focused Sky Tower track. My name is Amy June Heinlein, and I am the Open Source Community Ambassador and QA Engineer at Canopy Studios. I have the unique privilege of getting paid to give back to open source communities, including WordPress and Drupal. Christina Workman is a support technician at Web Dev Studios. She has over a decade of experience with WordPress and contributes to WordPress in many ways, including organizing, speaking, volunteering at not only WordCamps, but Kid Camps, contributor camps, and WordPress meetups as well. I had the privilege and pleasure of meeting Christina a couple of years ago at WordCamp Calgary, where she was an organizer and I was a speaker. And since then, we've worked together organizing Contributor Day at WordCamp US. Not a whole lot more to say because I know what you're here for. You're here for the session, which is understanding neurodisabilities. Computers don't run the same operating system, and neither do our individual brains. Because when planning a website, disabilities affecting the brain are often the last accessibility consideration, many times even overlooked completely. This presentation will discuss several groups of cognitive neurological disabilities and highlight the ways to make your website more accessible for people who live with these disabilities. If you have any questions for Christina, be sure to post the questions in the YouTube chat feed or in Slack, and we'll answer those at the end of the talk. And if you haven't joined the Santa Clarita Slack space, you can find the link on the homepage. Thank you.
Hello, WordCamp Santa Clarita. Thank you for joining me today for Understanding Neurodisabilities. Computers don't run the same OS, and neither do our individual brains. My name is Christina Workman. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I build and support WordPress websites at WebDev Studios in the Maintain division. I've been building and working with WordPress sites for about 10 years. And I have been advocating for contributing for a few years now, and recently started the contributor working group. I like to relax with British murder mysteries and a giant cup of tea. A little bit about accessibility and me. I've been learning about accessibility with websites for about 3 years now and counting. I wish I could say it's been longer, but about 3 years, and there is still lots to learn. I am by no means an expert. I have increasingly poor eyesight. I'm at a point now where my glasses are in desperate need of a new prescription, and I probably need some form of reading glasses as well. I have also had frequent temporary disabilities. I've had a 6-week-long migraine. I've had a broken arm while having to develop a website. I think, if I recall right, I had a broken or sprained finger as well. Probably a couple of other ailments, and of course, numerous situational disabilities that we all could probably relate to as well. And I like to think of my family as neuro-fun. We have a lot of neurological disabilities within my immediate family. So for today's agenda, we're going to talk about why neurological disabilities, why this talk, what they are, and why this talk is important to me. We will also talk about some types of neurological disabilities, and then we'll get into some website tips that you can take home and practice for yourself and start putting to use on websites. So let's get right into it, talking broadly about some neurodisabilities as a group first. So what are neurodisabilities? A neurodisability, or a neurological disability, is a disability or disorder that affects the nervous system. So we're talking about the brain, the nerves, and the spinal cord. These are pretty complex systems, so you can imagine there are a lot of different types of disabilities and disorders that could be covered under this umbrella. People may experience permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities, or situational disabilities, all under neurological disabilities. And all of these are important to be considering when you are building a website. So why do I care about neurological disabilities? Well, as I mentioned, I have a neurofun family. Particularly, my son has been officially diagnosed with 4 of the different types of neurological disabilities that we're going to be talking about today. These differences have a huge impact on how he functions in the world and how the world perceives him. And in a way, his disabilities are invisible. A lot of people don't think that he has any disabilities. They don't think that his struggles are real or that they're any different than what any other kid his age might be going through. Strangers might not know that he has any disabilities at all. Yeah, as I mentioned, some people may think that his disabilities are just things that kids go through all the time and that he's going to grow out of them. But he's not going to grow out of them any more than somebody who has permanent blindness is suddenly going to miraculously develop sight. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we are considering people with neurological disabilities when we build websites. And particularly in our industry, it's worth noting that there are probably a lot of people who have neurological disabilities. Particularly you tend to hear a lot of people who have ADHD and autism in particular, and some of the mental health disabilities as well that we're going to talk about. There tends to be a higher occurrence, maybe from awareness, maybe not, but it does tend to be a lot of people are in our industry. So you may identify or resonate with some of these things that we're going to talk about today. Oops. So, sorry about that. So, neurological disabilities. I consider them the Linux OS of the accessibility world. So what do I mean by that? If we did a Family Feud survey, surveying 100 people randomly on the street, and asked them what operating system their main computer used, assuming they knew what we were talking about, in general, we would probably get some form of answer in line with Windows or Mac. Those would be the top 2 answers on the board. And the numbers would not add up to 100, probably. There probably would be a few people who had other answers, and one of those other answers might be Linux. And those people who answered Linux are probably people in the computer industry, maybe devs, maybe software engineers of other types, maybe just computer geeks or people who are interested in computers in general, but people who are in the computer industry in some form or another. And it would probably be similar if you did some sort of survey like that of disabilities. If you asked people, what type of disabilities do we need to consider for websites? People would say things like visual disabilities or audio disabilities. You may have a couple of answers more than just 2, but again, they probably wouldn't all answer or add up to 100. And probably the neurological disabilities would be the bottom of the list or pretty close. You wouldn't have as many of those as answers. People who did answer those types would probably be people who are fairly knowledgeable about accessibility or who are already in the accessibility world. So when we do a search for top tips for accessibility or how can I get quick fixes for accessibility, fast ways to fix my website for accessibility, we're usually going to see results for visual disabilities, physical disabilities, and audio disabilities. Things like color contrast, font sizes, putting in alt text, keyboard navigation, transcripts, all of these kinds of things are sort of the top things that come up. And none of these are specifically necessarily related to, or at least immediately identified as being fixes for neurological disabilities. They do sometimes, as you'll see, have some uses, but typically they're not considered neurological accessibility fixes. And so we want to look into having more awareness for that. So, neurological disabilities are often overlooked and underconsidered. They're not accommodated with overlay plugins frequently, and they are affecting a larger population than you're probably aware of, and as I mentioned before, particularly in the tech community. So let's get to understanding some of these neurological disabilities. Please note, I am not a medical doctor. These are brief, generalized, incomplete descriptions that focus on elements that are relevant to interacting with websites, specifically for the purposes of this talk today. So the first one we are going to talk about is ADHD. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And this impacts parts of the brain that help us plan, focus on, and execute tasks. People with ADHD may have difficulty focusing or be easily distracted. And please note, these are not necessarily the same thing. They may have short-term memory, and they may have difficulty making decisions. Next, we have autism. Autism is a group of conditions that cause social, communication, and behavioral challenges. Autism is also referred to as ASD, or Autism Spectrum Disorder, and the key word there is spectrum. It is a wide variety of presentations, different variations of how people present with different skill sets and how they are affected by these different things. They can be very literal thinkers. As you can see, Drax in Guardians of the Galaxy here, nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast, I would catch it. They are often direct and communicate using very to-the-point conversation. They're not up for small talk very often. They can have sensory processing overload, and they often prefer consistency, dependability, and uniformity. And just a side note here that the title of my talk is a bit of a nod to a saying in the autism community when talking about how people with autism think differently, that it's not a processing error, it's a different operating system. So that's sort of where I got my talk title from. Learning disabilities. These are an information processing problem that prevents a person from learning a skill and using it effectively. So we often see this as a reading, writing, or number processing disability. Previously, these were referred to as dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. They are now technically referred to as learning disabilities in the areas of reading, writing, processing numbers. And in some parts of the world, they may be called intellectual disabilities or processing disabilities. But it is important to note that these are not related to or indicative of a person's intelligence. Next, we have memory impairments. So, quite simply put, this is an inability to remember information. And this could be short-term or long-term. It could be from a disorder such as dementia. It could be an issue such as having a concussion, or something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And another thing that not everybody is aware of is a working memory issue. And just to explain that a little bit more, if you think of somebody who is good at math and you give them two numbers to add, say 323 and 468, and you timed them and you gave them two different options, maybe two different sets of numbers as well. One where they were able to write the numbers down and do the math on a piece of paper, versus one where they had to do the math in their head. Same type of problem, same difficulty level. It may take them considerably longer to do the one they have to do in their head if they have a working memory issue, because they're having a hard time remembering the numbers while they're trying to do the math equation. Whereas if it's written down for them, they don't have to store the numbers in their working memory while they're using that information. So again, that's another way that memory impairments can come into play when we're dealing with websites, maybe with input fields, and just if there's information we're trying to keep in our head while doing something else on a site. Mental health. This is something I think over the last year and a half or so, we have all become aware of in one form or another, but just to be clear, mental health is referring to cognitive, emotional, and behavioral well-being, and it can refer to how we think, feel, and act. There are a wide variety of different mental health issues. Paranoia, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. I myself have chronic depression. It's fairly well managed most of the time, but interestingly enough, Eeyore has always been my favorite. Winnie the Pooh character, one of my favorite Disney characters, and people often liken some of the Winnie the Pooh characters to different mental health issues, and Eeyore tends to represent depression, and he's my buddy. Anyways, mental health. People with mental health issues can have difficulty focusing, processing, or understanding information. If you are depressed and in a mental state of fog, or if you're anxious, you're not thinking very clearly, information is not going through properly. And interestingly enough, something I never really thought of myself until I was sort of looking around and researching for this talk, medication side effects to help people with these various mental health issues can also cause other disabilities. So things like blurred vision or hand tremors. So one type of disability, a neurological disability, can also end up causing a side effect of a visual disability or a physical disability. And the last one that we have here is seizure and vestibular disorders. So these are disorders that can cause seizures or other issues with the vestibular system, which is your inner ear and brain system. So if you have your inner ear controls your balance, and so you can have that kind of knocked out of whack, and that can cause some problems. So, of course, the thing that we most often associate with seizures is if you have epilepsy, but migraines fall under this category. And if you have some of those vestibular issues, then you can have issues, side effects like nausea and dizziness, balance issues, things like that as well. So, now that you know a little bit about people with neurological disabilities who may be visiting your website, how can you ensure you're doing your best to ensure that they have a pleasurable and successful visit on your website? We will talk about a few things here. This is not a comprehensive list, but certainly a way to get started. Interestingly, you may already be familiar with some of these tips, either for other accessibility purposes, like we've mentioned, visual purposes or something like that. Unrelated to accessibility, something like maybe an SEO, and maybe something that you don't even actually know why it's a good thing to do. You just know it's a good thing to do. And if someone asks you why, you wouldn't know, but now you'll have an answer to give them, and it'll be a good, irrefutable answer that will help you move forward. So I've broken these down into layout options, language, and control options. So we'll start with layout. So first we have text alignment. So primarily when we're talking about large chunks of text, we want to left align text. And this is something that often is just a good decision to make for design purposes, especially if you're wanting to present as modern or professional. And just something that we just sort of know in general that we want to do. But there are actually reasons for accessibility that we want to be doing this that help people with neurological disabilities. So if we look at the centered or justified text, you'll see, if we take a look at the centered here first, and if you can imagine this going on even longer and longer, the centered text, it's really jagged edges here, right? Here and here on both sides. And as you're reading along, particularly the longer your lines are, the longer your sentences are here. As you go from here, let me just show you. If you go from here to the beginning of the next line, and as you try to read and find each next line, it starts to get harder as you get further down the page, because you're trying to find the new line in inconsistent places. And so it can be hard to figure out where the next line was because everything is so jagged and inconsistent. So that can be really hard to read, and it's also just really distracting. Now, when we're talking about justified text, and this is something that I don't think that generally people who build websites professionally do, but I know that I personally have had clients ask for from time to time, and they're typically coming from the days of print, or when they're looking at books and things like that, which we would do this kind of a justification. But on websites, we don't want to do this. And the reason is, what happens is when you start getting bigger spaces in between the words, you start to see, let me see if I can find a good one. You start to see these gaps, and the words start, if you kind of cross your eyes a bit and blur the words, you start to see these, we call them white rivers, that start to go flowing through the text. And so somebody with ADHD or possibly dyslexia, somebody who gets distracted, might see these white rivers, and that's all they can see now, and they can't focus on the actual words because they're being distracted by these white rivers that are zigzagging through the words. So that's the reason why we want to make sure that we are left aligning our text, particularly large chunks. All right. The next one is line length. So this is another one that you're going to see that we tend to do in general for all people because of how we've been taught that we scan as humans. We scan text on the web when we're looking for information. So it's good to have short lines to be able to scan through. But another reason why we want to use short lines and not long lines, particularly on full width paragraphs like this, is that it actually becomes really hard, again, similar to the center lines, to find the next line at the beginning of the next line. So again, not so much at the beginning of, of the first couple, right? Like, you can see this is line 1, so this is line 2. This is line 2, so this will be line 3. But when you get into the middle of the paragraph here, I don't know what number line this is, and I'm not counting lines as I'm reading generally. So to find from here, without actually drawing a line, if I just kind of come over here and guess, lucky guess here, I got it right. But if I just kind of pick, I could get it wrong. I could think it's this line, but it's actually this line. So the longer the paragraph and the longer the line, the harder it is for somebody in general, but particularly somebody with a neurological disability that affects their processing, their reading, their distraction, to be able to find the beginning of the next line when lines are really long. So another reason, other than just for scannability, to make sure that you're keeping your lines short. Navigation. This is one of the key things when I asked my son, what do you find really important when you visit websites. And his main thing was that he was able to search a site and find exactly what he's looking for, instead of being confused and not, having to go all over the place, searching different places, not finding it, and getting lost. So some navigation tips in general: make important information easy to find. Make your site searchable, whether that's, if you just have a couple of pages, in general, it should be okay. And in general, like he said, he can, hit Control or Command F and he can scan the couple of pages for the word he's looking for or whatever. But having a search bar, search icon, something like that, where he can go and search to find the word or the information that he's looking for is really helpful. And group similar pages into submenus so that you can keep your top navigation short. So on the flip side of that, you don't want to have long top menus that flow over lots of different lines and overwhelm visitors, right? So if you can group things together, things that belong together, and keep those top menus short, then it'll make sense. And make sure that, so under don't create mismatched submenus that don't belong under the parent menu, because that just won't make sense and people won't know to look under that area to find what they're looking for, and that'll be confusing. And similarly, don't hide your contact information. So don't bury contact, like a contact page. Don't bury that even under an about submenu. Don't bury it under services. Don't put it in, like, that should be top menu for sure. And people come to expect contact information to be in a few different places and easy to find. So you want to make sure your contact information is always easy to find. But in general, make sure that your site is easy to navigate, and that the user flow is good for people in general, but also specifically for people with neurological disabilities. So now some language options. Screen readers and captioning. Make sure that you're providing multiple ways to consume your content. So we've got text, audio, and video. Don't assume that screen readers and captioning are only for people with audio and visual disabilities. There's lots of reasons, even outside of neurological disabilities, that people will use screen readers and captioning and subtitles, transcripts, all of those different opportunities. Somebody who is who needs an extra way to focus on the information that they're listening to or that they're reading. So if they're watching a video, they might benefit from having the captions or subtitles to have them focus or have them understand the words that they're listening to better. Some people are just better processing information through words rather than video, which isn't to say that they can't hear the information that's being said, but they'll process it better if they're also reading it. And some people, as they're reading, their minds start to stray and start to wander if they're just reading on their own. But if they have the benefit of a screen reader reading that information to them as they're reading along with the screen reader, they actually are able to maintain better focus and remember and pay attention better. So screen readers and captioning benefit people with neurological disabilities and a multitude of other people as well. Form input fields. There are a huge variety of accessibility tips that anybody could go into with forms in general that would cover a wide variety of issues. But for now, I'm just going to talk specifically about labels and how they can benefit people with neurological disabilities. And specifically, we're going to talk about labels. So labels are these things right here. Like we've got name, email, comment, or message, right? So in this example here, we have the labels being used properly. And I was able to punch in my name, and I can still see that the field here is a name field. That's what it wants, my name there. And a screen reader is going to read that properly. Everything is set up properly with that. Now over here, what you don't want to do is use placeholder text as a label. And sorry, my face is in the way for this particular one. So don't use it. Don't use the placeholder text as the label. Throw that back up there for a second. So in this example, you can see here, this is placeholder text. It's actually not a label. It's not coded as a label. Screen reader's not going to know that's a label. As I started typing my name in, the placeholder text disappeared. And so if I delete my name, or if I put the wrong information in here, I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. And so this is one of those examples where that working memory can come into play, and a couple of other things as well. So we really want to make sure, for a variety of reasons, that we have proper labels here. There was a time where, actually it happens quite frequently with me, if I'm entering in for like a newsletter opt-in, and they just have 2 input fields, name and email. And sometimes it's name, email, and sometimes it's email and then name. And oftentimes, because, you know, we're so used to doing these things, and we're also tired and frustrated with having to do these things sometimes, that I just quickly type my information in and don't think twice about it. And I usually just punch in my name and then my email, but oftentimes it wants it the other way around. And I wasn't thinking, and I hit send, and it gives me the errors saying I did it wrong. But it doesn't necessarily fill the information back in if it's not properly labeled, and if the information isn't there, and it just becomes a whole big issue where I don't know what I'm supposed to put anymore because I don't have the proper information. So make sure that you're using labels properly. And content. Make sure your content is easy to understand. Images replacing text make sense. Don't use complicated words and phrasing, acronyms that you don't explain the first time you're using what they mean, or metaphors that aren't easy to understand. If we go back to the autism, people taking phrases literally, right? So the words going over Jax's head, that's a metaphor that he didn't understand. When I was a little kid, somebody told me my grandpa was pulling my leg, and my grandpa was across the room, and I looked down and I'm like, how could he be pulling my leg? He's nowhere near me. So I understand that now, of course, that they meant that he was just joking with me, but you want to make sure that people are going to understand the phrasing that you use on your website, no matter what their reading level is, what their comprehension level is, whether they take things literally. And regarding images replacing text, I have an example here that's taken from how the events widget is currently on the WordPress dashboard of any site, if you go into where it lists the upcoming events that are near you. And it says attend an upcoming event near you, and it's got a pencil icon. And I always assume the pencil icon, I've learned it to mean, that means edit. And so when I saw this, I thought, well, what would I edit here? I don't understand. And when I finally, I'm a bit of a rule follower, and so I was a little bit nervous to click on the pencil icon, because I mean, it's my own site, I don't know what I would break, but I finally got up the nerve to click on it one day, and it did a drop down, opened up some more information, and it was basically a search bar where you could type in a different city, so you could change your location and find events near a different city other than the one it thinks you're near. And I realized that that's actually not an appropriate icon to be using there. It's not, the meaning of that icon is not clear because it means edit, but it wasn't clear what you were actually editing. The context around that wasn't clear. So I've actually made my first suggestion to WordPress core for a change. And so it's under consideration for changing it to possibly just some form of a text link that says change location or something like that, and possibly with an icon or whatever else, but something that is a lot clearer that indicates that you can change the location. And I had considered maybe putting a search icon at first, and then I realized, well, that might be confusing to people who think you can then search for a particular event. So you have to be really conscientious about what icons and images you're using to replace text, and make sure that without text that the intention is really clear. So a couple of control options. Animation and movement. Do keep flashing content to 3 flashes or less per second. Don't use lots of movement close together. So this is one of those things we think specifically of with making sure that we don't trigger seizures in anybody, but it can also just trigger just unpleasant feelings in certain people, that sensory process overload, things like that. So something that we want to be aware of there. Video and audio. We want to make sure that we're providing controls to start and stop these things, that we're not using autoplay or having instant loud sound effects. I know this is something that, a lot of us are aware of in general overall, but these kinds of things can be, again, triggering for people who have sensory processing overload. Somebody who doesn't like loud noises, they may just slam their computer shut, or at the very least navigate away from your site and not come back because that was just too much intensity for them. So you want to make sure that you give people opportunities to turn those things off and not have things automatically happening that are going to upset them right away in general. And the last one here is time pressure. So do provide ample time to read and make decisions, and don't use unnecessary countdowns. One of the things I've seen, I think it's on Eventbrite, if you don't have an account yet and you want to book tickets for something, and it'll say, great, you can create an account and you won't lose your tickets or whatever, and it puts like an 8-minute counter up, and you can see the seconds ticking by as you fill out your account to create your own account. And 8 minutes may seem like a lot of time, but if you are somebody who has difficulty making decisions, stress in that area, or just general anxiety, having that clock ticking and counting down like that can be really stressful and can cause you to make errors, or can cause you to just have so much stress that you just can't complete the process at all. So if you don't need to have a countdown or any sort of time pressure forcing people to make immediate decisions, give them that opportunity to take time, and don't give them those countdowns. Likewise, sort of on a different vein, if you have something like a testimonial carousel that's going through, make sure you're giving people time to read those things, and ideally time or the ability to control when they flip through, for different reasons, mostly in the area of processing, right? Not everybody reads at the same speed. And if somebody has, again, say, a learning disability in the area of reading, they may need that extra time. And if you flip it on them before they've had a chance to read, they may or may not want to go back and read what it is. And if it's just a testimonial, it may or may not be a huge impact. But if it's some other kind of important information, and you've just flipped them and not let them have a chance to read, they may or may not want to go back and read the rest of that, and they may give up. So give people time to do things, process information, make decisions, all of these different options. So with that, I hope that I've convinced you our brains are not all running the same operating software, and that your website should be supporting as many of these as possible. I have a couple of credits and resources, some pages that have helped me as I've been doing a bit of research. And the last one there, accessibilityinsights.io, is one of my favorite resources for doing some tests and assessments. So thank you. I'm available to answer questions. You can find me on Twitter at Amethyst Answers. It's really not the easiest to spell. It's AmethystansWers. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Christina.
Hey.
That was fantastic. Because, with my nursing background, I really think about a lot of the physical disabilities when I think about website accessibility. And some of the neurological stuff comes into play, but I really appreciate your walkthrough of the different processing disabilities as well,
Right.
That breakdown really helps me think about like page layouts and animations and things like that. With saying that, I'm wondering, are there any techniques or tools that you would recommend for evaluating your site for better accessibility for neurological differences, or is it mostly visual testing?
I think a lot of it is knowing sort of some of those things that you need to be watching for. I don't know that there's anything in particular that's specifically designated for neurological testing, but if you're doing anything that has testing for the standards for like WCAG 2.1 in general, like one of the tools that I like is, it's mentioned in my last slide there, the accessibilityinsights.io. And they have a really extensive assessment that you can do that involves some automated and some manual testing that you can do. And those will cover a lot of the neurological things as well, if I remember correctly. So they'll walk you through like checking to see is everything understandable, or is your line length this sort of within this character amount or things like that. And so you have to actually go and look. But some of it is just sort of being aware and making judgment calls, right? Things that automated tests can't necessarily do. An automated test can't, for example, like that one where I had the edit button where it was the pencil. An automated test can't tell what the intention of that pencil was to know whether or not somebody with processing information is going to be able to understand exactly what the point of that was.
Right. There's something like, I think about the justification on a page, because I too have a hard time like adjusting as I read. And I know that left justification is better for most folks. I'm wondering about headings and titles. Sometimes we see them centered. Is it better visually to have them on the side as well?
I don't have an answer for that, actually. I haven't come across anything in any of the things that I've read that specifically talks about titles. Mm-hmm. I imagine, again, if they're longer titles, you would want to keep them left aligned. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure. I mean, certainly you want to keep them so that they are close to the content that they're representing. So if you have, say, a 2-column layout where there's text on the one side and an image on the other side, and a short title that's just in the middle, that might not be very good because it's not really directly related depending on how it is. So
sure, it might be a case where you have to go back and adjust if you have like titles of different lengths and something like that.
Yeah, okay. Case by case basis, possibly.
Right. There was a question from Ron in chat using the POUR acronym, which is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Which of these best addresses the needs of the neurologically disabled?
That is a great question. And I will admit I am not amazing at the POUR acronym yet. But I would say, being that the neurological disabilities cover such a wide range of disabilities, probably all of them get touched on. Probably the understandable and perceivable would probably be where most of them fall into, I think.
I think so too, because like understandable and having like predictable page layouts and things like that, where we can remember how to use the interface from page to page, because there's nothing more disconcerting when you navigate to the team page and then go back to the blog where the buttons and everything's in a different place and order. And talking about poor leads me to, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, the WCAG guidelines 3.0 specifically target folks with like, it's more content based, you know, to help our neurologically diverse friends.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because you're an integral part of the WordPress contribution team, are there any plans to kind of target that at a sprint coming up soon? I know that the guidelines haven't passed yet, but, you know, sometimes addressing things prophylactically and getting them rolling.
Right.
Do you know of any plans to sort of address those needs?
That I'm not sure of. That would be probably a question for the accessibility team specifically.
Sure.
And I'm not directly involved with them, but definitely a good question to be asking.
And then you might not have the answer to this too, but it gets people thinking.
Absolutely.
You had mentioned suggesting a change to WordPress core. What is the process for that? Did you do it in Track? Did you do it someplace else? Because all of us experience accessibility in a different way. What do we do if we find something that we want to get changed in core?
Yeah, so I did it in Track. Now I have to think, because it was the first time that I had submitted an issue. So I went to make.wordpress.org, and then I would have gone into the core team. And I think there's a link there that is in order to submit a bug that you click there, and then there's some instructions there. And so it would have been on Track, and there's like a form to fill out where you can submit, you give, you know, like a subject of what your issue is, and you're asked to first do a search of all of the tickets that are in there to make sure that somebody else hasn't already submitted the same issue. So I did that first, and so I targeted, because mine was in the, and I double checked what it was called, the events widget, I think, events and calendar widget or something like that within the dashboard. So I searched for that, and I searched for a couple of other phrases that were related to what I was submitting for, and some things came up, but nothing that were related specifically to what I was doing. So then I submitted a subject line, bit of information. It asks you a couple of, you can fill out a couple of check marks about what type of issue it is, what it relates to. So I put like dashboard because it was part of the dashboard, and I put accessibility because it was accessibility. And I think because I submitted it as I checked off the accessibility team specifically seemed to take it in as their bug scrub. And so they acted on it, and then they started commenting on it. And so because I've submitted it, I get emails to see how it's being updated and what they're talking about doing with it. And so so it looks like it's going to be, they've made some suggestions on how they're going to, what they're thinking about approaching the change as, and hopefully it will be modified in 5.9.
Cool. That's cool. The process sounds pretty easy and straightforward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I like the idea of being able to let folks know that they can actually submit the issues too. And it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because all of us, like I said, interact with the interface so completely different. You know, we're not all developers, but we are in the back end or the front end or whatever. We're not always, you know, college educated or whatever, you know, so there's so many different scenarios of different types of people. So having that like accessible track queue, I think, is really valuable to make WordPress more inclusive.
Yeah, and I had never used Track before. So, you know, there was a couple of things where I wasn't quite sure, but I just did the best I could. And the really neat thing is that because it was my first time submitting, when somebody did reply, and it took a couple of weeks, so don't expect an answer like right away. But as part of my first initial reply, I got a little like, congratulations on submitting your first bug or whatever. So, you know, it was kind of a happy, friendly little thing as well. So, yeah.
Nice. So we are at time because we want to make sure that the next
Absolutely.
presenter has time to get ready and get prepped, and all the back end stuff happens behind the scenes at WordCamp Santa Clarita. So I want to thank everyone for attending Christina Workman's session today. If we didn't get to your question or you think of any later, be sure to post them in the general channel in Slack. And if you haven't joined Slack yet, you can find the link to join on the website's homepage. Remember after this to rest your eyes and to hydrate and come back for the next talk, which is Accessibility is More Than Disability Accommodation, with another friend of ours, Michelle Frechette, and that's at 3 p.m. right here at the Sky Tower track. And we hope to see everyone after the break. And thank you, Christina. That was a lovely presentation.
Great. Thanks. Glad you enjoyed it.